Welcome back. In this lecture, we will look at certain experiments and observation which led to the emergence of nuclear sciences. So let's look at some fairly common experimental features that were mainly centered around Europe, that were critical for the development or the nucleation of nuclear sciences. One is the capacity to have vacuum. This is not something very trivial, but people were able to generate vacuum in a controlled manner. That was very important for decoupling certain events. For example, if you want to improve the distance traveled by electrons, let's say when electrons are ejected from some surface, the distance they can travel depends very critically the on the amount of vacuum that is present. If there are a lot of gases, the electrons typically cannot travel to large distances. So vacuum was very important in decoupling certain physico-chemical events. All right. Then all this vacuum in the experiments we would be seeing were attained inside glasses. So both vacuum generation and glass blowing was well developed in certain parts of Europe. That really helped. Okay, glass blowing helps in not only setting up experiment, because glass is transparent, it helps in visualizing certain effects. We'll see um, what kind of effects we are referring to. Another feature is it was possible to attain high voltages via induction coils. Um, as you may have heard in your high school, um, Galvani and Volta developed batteries in the modern sense. And it is not by having batteries in series you attain high voltages that uh, have to be attained. This would be few hundred electron volts and so on. The few hundred volts giving rise to energies of the order of few hundred electron volts. They were not attained by batteries in series, but via induction coils. That results in the first splitting of atom. What I mean by splitting of atom is that um, in in the older times, let's say uh, for a long time, it was believed that atoms cannot be split into further subcomponents. But supposing you have removed electrons from atoms, in a way, you have split atom. I'm not referring to fission in this context. Just by removing electrons from atoms, you have, in a way, split atom. So you would see that capacity to have high voltages across two electrodes helps you split atom. That is, helps you to remove electrons from um, a bunch of atoms or from the electrode. That is a critical um, experiment. We'll see how all these things come together to give rise to nuclear science. Then, whatever you do, uh, these experiments have to be recorded and the observations have to be communicated. The art of photographic plates played a big role in being able to record certain observations. So, all these three aspects, vacuum and glass blowing, capacity to have high voltages, and recording in photographic plates were critical. All these things came together to lead to the emergence of nuclear science. We'll move on. So, you might have heard something called cathode rays in your high school. So, what you have here is you have two electrodes and you have high voltage between the electrodes. I'm not referring to 4 or 10 volts. Uh, Here we are referring to hundreds of volts. So with such voltage bias between the electrodes, it is possible to have certain rays from the cathode. And when you place a solid object, this solid object casts a shadow. So these rays that are coming from these electrodes cast a shadow here. Not only it casts a shadow, it also leads to certain glow on this surface. This green glow is occurring from this surface, right? Uh, so this was an important observation. So this gave rise to an inference that there were some rays that were emanating from this cathode. Rays is sort of an notion from geometric optics, that is, that are something that are traveling in straight lines, right? That's what we commonly mean by rays. So this was an important observation. Then another aspect of cathode rays was also um, realized via certain simple experiments. So here we have what, from this schematic, there's a more realistic photograph of a real experimental setup. So you see two electrodes and you see some glow here and you see a different kind of glow here. And this is the object that is being used, and this is the shadow of this object because of this object. So when you have this experiment, when you place a magnet, uh, let's contrast. Okay, so here the poles of the magnet have been reversed. With this, what you are able to observe is that a magnetic field deflects these rays. This suggests that these rays have a charge, and not only that, it also tells you they have certain particle nature, right? The Lorentz force is the way to interpret these experiments. So by reversing the magnetic field, the shadow is moved upwards or downwards. It tells you that these rays have charge and also they are of particle nature. So this is an important observation which gives you certain additional insight into the nature of the cathode rays, which we now know that they are made up of electrons. But at that time, all these observations uh, gradually added insight to the nature of the rays. Then we'll move on. So certain additional experiment gave additional insight. So what we have here is, again, two electrodes under high voltages, but what could be changed was the nature of the gas that was inside the tube could be changed. And when the nature of the gas changed, the color from these tubes also changed. If not, not only the nature of the gases, the extent of vacuum also control the extent of color and the nature of color that came out of the tubes. We are not going to go into the structure of these color here, so that requires a lot more plasma physics that is beyond the scope of these lectures. But the important observation is that the nature of the gases inside the tubes had an important correlation with the color that you got from these tubes. And as you employed more and more vacuum inside the tube, the nature of the glow also changed. At that time, this was not only important scientific observation, many people uh, also practice these kinds of observation as a form of art. There were certain businesses which evolved around this art of generating colors from these experiments. So that helped in popularizing these observations. So again, these links it gives you additional information. So please go through these links to get some more insight into these observations. So from the cathode rays, we'll move on to certain other kinds of rays which are closely related. Here we have um, rays which have certain interesting terminology: channel or canal rays or anode rays. The reason for all these nomenclature is will be clarified with the schematic. But before going into the schematic, let me clarify what we see here. Here we see again two electrodes, and there is a way to fill the tube with certain gases or to create vacuum in this tube. And this is the tube without electrical bias. This is a tube with electrical bias between the two electrodes. Um, the reason for this glow is because of two things. One is there is a fairly significant bias between the anode and a perforated cathode. Right? When you have this, what happens is there are certain species which are accelerated to very high energies, and some of these species get past these perforations and excite certain energy modes of the gases that are present here, and the de-excitation of these gases give rise to certain form of glows. Okay, so if you change the nature of gases and the extent of vacuum, you can change the nature of the glow that is present. So again, so canal or channel is because of the perforations in the cathode, and anode, that is because these rays in a way emerged from the anode. So whether it is anode ray or cathode rays, there are some charged species that were getting accelerated due to the bias. That is the important observation. We'll put all these observation together as we progress via some experiments. So switching gears, it's important to um, recall our notions of electromagnetic spectrum. Here, in few in the previous experiment using magnetic field, we clarified that the rays were made up of charged particles. Uh, Here, we want to clarify certain aspect of waves. Okay, so our view of reality has objects of two different kinds, right? One, objects, we refer to them as particles, and there are other objects which we refer to as waves. Quantum mechanics says that the wave and particle nature are inherent to all objects, but without getting into quantum mechanical notions, we will just refer to certain classical notions. Here we are referring to the electromagnetic spectrum. So what is important to understand here is that we want to get a sense for the wavelengths uh, of the electromagnetic spectrum. So when we are talking about, let's say, radio waves, these are fairly large wavelength electromagnetic waves. Microwaves have shorter wavelengths, infrared, much shorter than radio waves and microwave. And as we go from infrared to visible to ultraviolet to X-rays to gamma rays, the wavelength keeps decreasing. With the decrease in wavelength, your frequency increases. And with the increase in frequencies, your energies associated with these rays also increase. This is all from just the classical notion is good enough to rationalize all these features. Um, and when you refer to X-rays or gamma rays, these are of the order of atoms, right? The X-rays have this particular wavelength. This is of the order of the size of the electrons. And this spatial structure is associated with the size of the atomic nucleus. So what we mean by the visible spectrum is a very narrow region of the electromagnetic spectrum. So we will also connect the frequencies to the wavelength in the next slide. So an important energy scale, which is good to have in mind, is what is kT at room temperature. So from equipartition theorem, you know that every degree of freedom or every excitable degree of freedom has an energy of half kT, right? This is the thermal energy stored in every excitable degree of freedom. If this is not clear, please refer to lectures in thermodynamics. I have some lectures wherein we have clarified these aspects. So kT at room temperature is of the order of 26 milli electron volts. Okay, this is not a significant energy. We'll see why this is small and small with respect to what. Okay, so again, so when you have, this is where kT is. So that is this energy is about 26 milli electron volts. So when you think about gamma rays, these are much higher in terms of EV. So visible uh, light comes somewhere here. The radio waves, microwaves have lower energy compared to this energy scale. Compared to this energy scale, these are much higher. So in terms of electron volts and Kelvin, another useful relationship to have in mind is 1 electron volt is approximately equal to this much Kelvin. Okay, so this is fairly high temperature. So why is this all important? Okay, so why do we need to have a feel for this? So if you look at chemical bond energies, these are typically few electron volts. So if you say what is the order of a covalent bond, you would say it's about 2 electron volts. So this energy scale is much less than 2 electron volts. Why is this important? Because with ordinary thermal energies available to you, you cannot excite or generate chemical bond changes, right? So if this kT had been much higher, say of the order of few electron volts, then you can form and break chemical bonds just via thermal energies. Because the thermal energies are much lesser compared to chemical bond energies, typical chemical bonds cannot be broken via thermal energies available to you at room temperature. However, hydrogen bonds can be broken with thermal energies. But what is important to note is this is much smaller than chemical bond energies. Also, because these are much, much larger, not only compared to this energy scale, These energy scales are much larger than chemical bond energies. So if you see gamma rays or X-rays coming out of a specimen, that is not because of chemical reasons. It is due to some other reasons, some other physical reasons. It can be due to excitation and de-excitation of inner electrons, or due to certain changes in the nuclear structure. So when you say chemical bond energies, we are still referring to rearrangement of electrons, but the electrons we are referring to are the rearrangement of valence electrons. You would see later in the next few slides that X-rays are due to rearrangement of inner core electron. But for chemical bonds, what we are interested in are in just valence electrons. So there were an important class of experiments due to what is commonly referred to as Crookes tube, um, and a variant of Crookes tube is the Coolidge tube. Okay, so all these things gave rise to generation of focused X-rays. So this is a Coolidge tube. We'll see there are a lot of information present. We'll gradually go into different subcomponents of the schematic. So here you have a coiled cathode. A coiled cathode gives rise to more surface area than what you would have had with just via a wire. When you have a coiled cathode and high electrical bias, what you have is that there are a lot more electrons that are ejected out from the surface of the coiled cathode. These coiled cathode, the electrons that are coming out of this coiled cathode are accelerated because of the electrical bias that is present between the cathode and the anode. And when they impinge on the anode, this, let's say, a metallic surface which is tilted, okay, so that the rays that are coming out of this anode can be collected in some other region. Okay, so this is typically it's glass. The tube made up of glass, so the rays can come out of this glass tube. So because it is tilted, you can get more of the X-rays in this region. So what is the important observation? The accelerated electrons impinging on the anode surface gives rise to certain rays. These are actually X-rays. And what are the some other components? The X-ray generation from this experimental setup, the efficiency of X-ray generation is not that much, but most of the energies from the collision between the electrons and this metallic surface goes as heat. Okay, so in order to keep the anode uh, cooled, you have water inlet, and water outlet is at a higher temperature. So this is kind of a heat exchanger which removes heat from the anode. So the central features is that you have high electrical bias, accelerated electrons impinge on the anode, which gives rise to electromagnetic radiation, which we now know are X-rays. So because these X-rays were undeflected by a magnetic field, which suggested that these are neutral in nature. Okay, they were not charged particles, they were neutral radiation. So the next interesting set of experiments was done by a scientist called Leonard. So what he tried to understand is he set up experiments wherein you can understand the penetration power of undeflected rays. That is, these were neutral electromagnetic radiations. Uh, and in this setup, again, you have a cathode, you have an anode, you can have electrical bias, and you can have um, radiations emanating from the glass surface. But what was different here was that here you had an aluminum foil. Okay, so aluminum foil um, was placed in this narrow aperture. So the question that was asked was, by changing the nature of covering, okay, supposing you can have, let's say, aluminum foil or some other material or a cardboard and so on, can you, how much of the radiation is being um, emanate is emanated out of this aluminum foil? Okay, so that was the question that was being uh, raised. Okay, so as you can see, there is a progression in in the complexity of the experiment, and each of the experiment added insight to the nature of reality uh, uh, that emerged from these kinds of experiments. Okay, so what is the question? If you place the kind of question that is being asked via the Leonard tube in the context of modern understanding, we can look at the question from from the modern sense. Typically, now we know that when we think about emanations from nuclear activity, you may have alpha rays, which can be stopped just by placing paper. So the penetration power of alpha rays is not that much. Beta rays, which are made up of electrons, can penetrate uh, paper but are stopped via aluminum foil. Okay, but if you have, let's say, gamma rays or X-rays, these are neutral radiation as opposed to these charged radiations. They can, X-rays and gamma rays can penetrate aluminum, but X-rays are stopped by lead, and gamma photons or gamma electromagnetic radiations are partially stopped by lead. Okay, so via Leonard tube, the question that was being asked was, what is the penetration power of the neutral radiation that was coming out from these kinds of experiments? So moving on, Röntgen um, added more to the observation without going into the complexity of Röntgen's experiment, which is presented, for example, in this link. Let's just look at the kind of observation that Röntgen made. Okay, this is very, very important. This led to a Nobel Prize for Röntgen. So what the question he was trying to ask was, supposing there are some salts, okay? So this a complicated salt, but what is important to understand was there is platinum that is present here, and this salt, let's say, when exposed to X-rays, when we look at it from what we know from certain modern understanding. So the question that was being asked was, supposing these salts were exposed to X-rays, in response to the X-ray exposure, these salts emanated some other rays. Okay, so this is, in the modern sense, this is called X-ray fluorescence. Okay, again, you can look into this link to get uh, greater understanding. So the important point to understand is, supposing you have X-rays, this X-rays excite electrons to a higher level, and there is a hole that is generated because of this excitation, and this hole can be filled in by an inner level electron, okay, and which gives rise to certain other radiation. Okay, so at the time of Röntgen, all these things were not known. What was known was um, certain experiments, let's say, with salts gave rise to X-rays, and what X-rays and fluorescence of from X-rays. Okay, so that is a set of observation that Röntgen was interested in. Let's see the consequence of these observations. So what Röntgen was very interested in is he did certain kinds of experiments that revolutionized not only physics and chemistry, um, but also had an important consequence for medical sciences. Okay, so it uh, all the modern medical X-rays emerged from the observations of Röntgen. So what Röntgen um, did was that he requested his wife. Okay, so this is the hand of Mrs. Röntgen, and this is the wedding ring um, on Mrs. Röntgen. So Röntgen asked his wife uh, to place her hand on top of photographic plates. Okay, so from such an experiment, okay, so she had to place her hand for a long period of time so that this image could be developed. What was inferred from this experiment was that the X-rays could penetrate flesh more easily and could partially penetrate different parts of the bone, but did not penetrate the wedding ring. This was a metallic wedding ring. Okay, so this spatial variation in color is because of variation in the penetration of X-rays. Okay, so in response to variation in transmission of X-rays, because of the presence of flesh, bone, and metallic part, uh, the photographic plate underneath Mrs. Ronge's hands, so there could be a variation in the transmission of X-rays, which gave rise to this picture. All right. So this was a remarkable observation. Okay, so that had a lot of consequence. Röntgen went on to get Nobel Prize. So there is an additional concept, okay, which we need to clarify. There are two related concepts: fluorescence and phosphorescence. Both are due to materials taking up electromagnetic radiation and giving rise to emanation of electromagnetic radiation. Okay, so typically fluorescence occurs quickly, phosphorescence is delayed. Okay, as soon as light is observed, some light is emanated. That's what we refer to as fluorescence. But if there is a time delay between exposure to radiation and emanation of radiation, that is referred to as fluorescence. And the time delay is because of certain quantum mechanical reasons, which we will not go into it further, but you can look into this link to understand the reasons for the difference in mechanism. The energy released in phosphorescence is lower than what is the energy released in fluorescence. And there is a time delay. Okay, so the time delay and the lesser energy release is the two main observations which I want to communicate. So typically in phosphorescence, the energy that is released in phosphorescence is lesser compared to the energy that is absorbed. So from Ronjan's experiment, we'll move on to next set of experiments by Henry Becquerel. Okay, as you may know, Becquerel was awarded Nobel Prize in Physics along with Pierre and Marie Curie. So again, Henry Becquerel was interested in phosphorescence kind of experiments. So what he was interested in was, he had these salts, he placed it in the presence of placed it in sunlight and was trying to monitor the radiations that were coming out of the salt after exposing it to sunlight. So he thought he was looking at phosphorescence because there was a time delay between the exposure to sunlight and the rays that was coming out of these salts. This is a very good site from American Nuclear Society. Please go through this website that has certain more information. It's uh, very useful information. Okay, so he thought he was looking at phosphorescence, but on a cloudy day, there is not much of a sunlight. But what he was very surprised to realize was that uh, these salts, even without exposure to sunlight, was giving rise to certain emanation. Okay, so it was radiation from this salt that was irrespective of exposure to sunlight. Not only that, these radiations persisted for a long period of time. Okay, and the power from the amount of energy released from these salts were significant. Okay, so what is important to understand is these salts were made up of, had uranium in the presence of uranium in the salt has finally landed us to the emergence of radioactivity. Okay, so this was Henry Becquerel's observation from fairly simple experiment. Okay, led to the birth of radioactivity. Radioactivity is a term that was coined by the Curies, Pierre and Marie Curie, but this observation was first made by Becquerel. Okay, so again, the nature of the observation was very similar to many previous observation. You typically place a cross, and this is a metallic cross, and this sort of blocked some part of the radiation, and here there is no cross, so more of radiation was present and led to darkening of the photographic plates. In this region, there was lesser darkening, and some salts can be placed. The salts were placed in this region, and that led to darkening of plates, or darkening photographic plates, um, uh, from where we can infer that these salts was giving rise to some radiation, which is intricately related to radioactivity. We will, in the next lecture, we will move on from the nucleation or from the birth of radioactivity, how it evolved with certain other experiments. That would be the set of topics for the next lecture. Thank you.